We want to talk about the guide we've created for television news reporters and anchors for delivery in times of crisis, because obviously we're in one and in a pretty remarkable time. And I know a lot of you have seen that. If you haven't seen it, you can get it on the website. But I hope you'll take a look at that, and we'll talk more about it, but weigh in at some point if you feel like that's something you want to do. We wanted to do this. We're going to do this today. We're going to do this at least a couple of more times for three reasons. First reason being that delivery is not something that we as an industry talk together a lot about. There are places that we talk about storytelling. There are places that we talk about production, newscast structure, but we don't share a lot about performance, and we don't share a lot about delivery. And that's a really interesting thing to us, because research has shown pretty definitively that you really cannot separate the message from the messenger. There's you just can't take them apart. And so essentially that means that how people feel about you, how they feel about your news, how they feel about you will have a lot to do with how they hear your stories and how they react to the things that are in your newscast. And so it feels like it's important to be having that conversation, especially now. We are in a time that is really unprecedented, and literally in a time where who people believe and who they trust can be a matter of life and death for them. And so essentially that means that the extent to which they believe you and the extent to which they trust you becomes a matter of life and death for people. We're in a time when that's not overstating that. So what I think essentially it means is that getting the delivery right is as important, or very close to as important, as getting your facts right. And so at the end of the day, we need to be as expert in that as we are in anything else that we're doing. And the third reason is that more people are watching, or people are watching now who normally would not be watching us. And chances are, I think, are reasonably good that for a number of viewers, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for television news people, because you have their attention in a way you have not before. I have to admit, I was a little concerned when I was reading an article on Facebook, I guess it was yesterday, and a quote from a news manager who had said, talking about this additional viewership, who was saying, well, he hoped that one result of this would be that people would recognize what they'd been missing and would continue the habit of watching when all of this was over. And that worried me, because for me, that's a little bit like saying, well, look, I know you didn't like my cooking, but now that you've got to eat it because you're really, really hungry, I'm hoping even though the recipe hasn't changed, I hope you'll realize how good it is and keep eating it after you're not so hungry anymore. And it just doesn't seem to me like that's the most powerful question for us. It seems to me like the question we ought to be asking is, what have we been missing? And how can we do this? How do we need to be in a way that when the pandemic is over, when the fear and anxiety that has driven people to us now subsides, the experience they will have had with us will have been good enough that it's something that they want to continue. And that has to have at least as much to do with you, with the people delivering the message, as it has to do with the message itself. I'll be interested in what other people have to say or think about this. It's hard for me to believe that after the pandemic, people are going to suddenly be interested in content that didn't interest them before the pandemic. And so I think if we have a chance of keeping them in for the long haul, then that will depend to huge extent on their experience of you, their experience of the people. What was the time with you like? And did it feel good enough? Did it feel important enough that that they want to continue? And so for all those reasons, it seems incredibly important to be talking about not just the messaging, but the messengers, which of course is what most of you represent. One thing this news director did mention in this article yesterday was the idea of people discovering that the organizations, local news especially, were organizations that they could trust. And I did like that. I think that that's a really important question. And it's really the thing that we are after. Interestingly, trusting you, I think, is a little different and a little deeper, a little bit more than believing you, or maybe it comes first. I've got to trust you before I really will believe what you have to say. But it's worthwhile to sort of frame all this, I think, by asking the question from that perspective, which is, what can we do? How do you deliver the news in a way that will really encourage people to trust you? There is some really powerful and I think important research. Those of you that I work with or that have been in some of my workshops have heard me talk about this, that has shown that the way that people decide who you are, and when I say who you are, I mean the way they decide things like whether you are an expert, whether you really know what you're talking about, or whether you're a leader, or whether you're a team player, whether you're authentically listening, whether you're authentically exploring for something. The signals we use to discern those things and make decisions about those things actually have very little with what you have to say, and are primarily signals you send in the way that you say things. And we'll be talking about the specifics of that as we get into this in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But again, the message is that what people are discerning really is embedded in things like your body language and the way that you use your voice. Our ability to hear tension and to discern things like that is really, really finely tuned. And those things are the basis for the choices we make about who folks are. So I was really interested. Those of you who've read the guide already, you'll see this when if you haven't, those of you who get it will read this. But I quote a guy named Fernando Flores, who some of you may be familiar with him. He's a world-renowned philosopher and business consultant. Has written a book specifically on trust, and I brought it. A book called Building trust. And he says a couple of things in there that I think are really, really important and critical to the conversation we're going to be having here. He says, first of all, that trust is developed through interaction and conversation. Trust is developed through interaction and conversation. It seems to me that really throws down a special gauntlet to TV newscasters, because what we do tends to be one way as far as the audience is concerned. It takes real work to make it for the audience an experience that feels interactional, that feels conversational. And here is someone saying that is exactly what you need to achieve to build trust. He also says, and this is a direct quote, he says, care is perhaps the most essential ingredient of authentic trust. Not only care about the immediate outcome, but care about the relationship. So essentially what he's saying there is to cultivate authentic trust with someone. They have got to believe that you care, not just about whatever you're discussing at any given moment, but that you care about your relationship with them. That's fundamental to cultivating authentic trust. And so obviously the one of the questions it begs is how do we, in the context of doing news, really demonstrate caring? To me, it's fascinating. It's really interesting if you think about it, that literally almost all of the most renowned and sort of storied moments in anchor history are moments of caring, are demonstrated caring. They're also moments of vulnerability. But think about Walter Cronkite announcing John F. Kennedy's death, or the first man on the moon, the first step on the moon. Peter Jennings watching the towers come down on 9/11. Little side note here, we may want to talk about this later, but those of you who are doing breaking news, if you ever want to go to school on the energy and the presence, the demeanor that matters in a moment of real fear and real crisis, then go to YouTube and watch Peter Jennings on the morning of 9/11. Actually, watch that whole team. It's a really good master class in that. So there's that. There's just Anderson Cooper hugging the woman who had lost her son in the shootings in Orlando. These are all really memorable moments. These were all, I say, well, in Anderson's case, he's still doing the work and still around, but the anchors of real credibility and who commanded huge respect. And what they're remembered for are the moments when we observed them feeling, when we observed and understood they really do care. He really do cares. And so, not surprisingly, I guess, that Walter Cronkite, of course, famously was at that time the most trusted man in America. So really important to note that caring is at the heart of this thing we're talking about. And demonstrating that is somehow at the heart of all this. Now, maybe important to talk for a minute about the idea that when we talk about caring, we're not talking about being subjective, although there are obviously things that human beings rightfully, and you even on air rightfully, should be subjective about. The first man walking on the moon is subjectively awe-inspiring. The assassination of a president is subjectively tragic. The loss of over 60,000 Americans is subjectively tragic. So there are times when we're all in agreement about those things. And I think just kind of without going too deeply into it, I guess I would think it's useful to keep on your radar the idea that objectivity, when it's important, is not a thing that's demonstrated best by having no feeling about either side of something. I think it's probably better demonstrated by having equal feeling or expressing different sides of something with equal energy. If you think that you demonstrate your objectivity by showing no feeling, the showing no expression and the stuff that goes along with that, then what you really risk is people looking at that and not going, gee, isn't she wonderful? She's being objective. And what you really risk is people looking at that and going, she seems bored. She doesn't seem to care. And so people have questions about that. We can talk more about that at some point, but I think it's good to have that in the conversation.
Before you move on, I do have a question.
Question, yeah.
Neil Adams is asking, where does likability fall in the equation? We hear so much about it in research, etc. Do likability and trust go hand in hand, or are they two separate concepts?
That's a great question, Neil. And I can't imagine, I don't think they are one and the same. I think there are people that we might say, actually, let me repeat the question because I'm not sure everybody heard it. Someone was just asking, what about the importance of likability? And because they hear a lot about that in research, and how does likability equate with trust? And are they the same thing? And I don't think they are the same thing. I think someone can be likable and be affable in a way that we enjoy, and whether we distrust them or not, I think might be another question. But I guess maybe I would say that I don't think earning trust is necessarily dependent on earning likability. Now, I think you could have the conversation about relatability and whether that equates a little bit more closely to trust. I had an interesting conversation with a client this week about an anchor who's working out of their home in a setting that, without going into a lot of detail here, with a setting that concerned me because it worried me that it was not a setting that would necessarily reinforce this person's relatability. And so I do think that, I guess the question at the heart of it is, do people believe you can understand what they are facing and what they are experiencing and where they are coming from? Different personalities do that in different ways. I will tell you that in research we have seen that personalities that people tend to trust, even though you might look at them and go, well, he's a pretty just kind of straight shooting, not especially affable guy, will still get credit from viewers for being relatable, even for having a good sense of humor. So, Neil, send me back a question. Let's send me back a note. Let me know if that's starting to answer your question. I don't think they're one and the same thing. I think certainly that being trusted is the higher goal. And maybe that's a good segue into the next piece of this, because from a delivery standpoint, when we're talking about trust or likability or relatability or any of those things, if you boil it down, what we're really asking here is, okay, well, in the human experience, what does trust look like? What does trust sound like? Because those literally are the things that you're managing when you are on the air. And those, again, literally are the things that the MIT research has identified people use to assign things like credibility. By the way, one other interesting thing about the MIT stuff is that they have found it is almost impossible to fake these things certainly for any extended period of time. So that should be reassuring to all of us. In some ways, maybe not in a minute, and I'll talk about that. But our ability to discern, like I say, functions on a pretty high level. And so these things like expertise and leading and authentic curiosity are actually pretty hard to fake when it comes down to it. I find that comforting for me. Anyway, so what does this stuff look, sound, and feel like? And I think a really important thing to understand for any of you who are working on air is that the answer involves the entire human being. And that's actually why we designed the guide the way that we did. It's in 3 parts, those of you who've seen it. And one we're going to talk about today, which is managing your thinking on air. Then we talk about managing your speaking. Then we talk about managing your doing. Another way we could language that would say we're talking about how your brain works, how you're using your voice, what you're saying, and what you're doing with your body. But the important thing to understand about that is the human being as a communicator is a system. And none of those things happen in a vacuum. They all change in one area affects change in each of the others. So if you change the way you move, interestingly, you will also change the way you sound, and you will change the way you think. I'll talk more about this when we get into the conversation in a couple of weeks on managing your doing. But one of the most telling findings, I think, that ever crossed my desk was research that showed that when your movement is constrained, that your memory shrinks, that you actually can access information in your brain less easily. And your vocabulary shrinks. When your movement is constrained, you actually use language less creatively. Your brain does not work as well when you are unable to move. And so that's a great example of how all of these things, are interrelated. And so important to understand that. The good news about that is that however it is most comfortable to you to work at your delivery, whether it's consciously working with your body language or doing something vocally or changing the way you're thinking. Wherever you work most easily, the good news is the work you do there will matriculate positively to other elements of your delivery as well. And so you can kind of choose what makes most sense and what works best for you. Now our goal with these conversations, with these lives, is to give you takeaways, things that you can you can literally do something with. And so we'll do that in each one of these conversations. Today we're talking about managing your thinking. And another way I could talk about that would say what we're talking about really is getting your mind right to deliver the news, and asking, okay, what does that involve? And what kind of thinking is actually going to serve you best? And I think there are two pieces of that, two big parts of that. One part, obviously, is how are you thinking about the content? How are you thinking about the news that you have that day? How's that living in your mind? The other, just as important actually, is to ask how you're thinking about the viewer. Really critical to understand that talking to a machine, talking to a camera, is fundamentally inhuman. It's one reason people don't appreciate how hard the job you guys do is, because they say, what could be so hard about that? You're just talking to a camera. But human communication evolved based on our ability to see the other person. I mean, I'll confess, it is so much easier for me to do a coaching session on Zoom than it is to be doing this right now, because right now I've got the challenge you guys have every morning or night or whenever you're on, which is I'm just looking at a machine. And human communication evolved based on our ability to see the other person. What we're really doing when we communicate is reacting to that. Those of you from communication school probably remember communication about the feedback loop, right? People in conversation are constantly observing each other, consciously and subconsciously, and that is what causes us to move and speak the way that we move and speak. So we take that away from you when we put you on camera. So we have put you in a situation that is fundamentally inhuman, and also means that the viewer is always, always, always a figment of your imagination. Now, you may have a fairly finely tuned imagination as far as your market, as far as your viewer is concerned, but nevertheless, when you are addressing a camera, the viewer is always a figment of your imagination. And so a really important, actually, question to be asking yourself is, how do I think about the viewer? How can I imagine the viewer in a way that brings out the best in me? I know those of you who have been in the business for a while would probably, I'd be surprised if you didn't say, Barry, this all makes perfect sense to me. I remember when I started out, I was worried that people would sort of figure out I was new and maybe didn't know as much about what I was doing as I wanted them to think I knew. And then as I did it more and more and began to really get the feeling that people kind of liked watching me and kind of enjoyed watching me, it relaxed me. It helped me do a better job at this. Well, it's important to understand that how we communicate is actually formed in large part, in a lot of ways, by who we believe we're talking to. If I let's say if I'm doing a play, and I want to put you in my play, and I'm giving you just one line, and your line, which should be easy for you to remember, is good morning, how are you? All right. So in the first scene, I need you to wake up a favorite child or niece or nephew it's a gorgeous, gorgeous Saturday morning. You're going to wake this 5-6-year-old up who just adores you, and you're taking him or her to the zoo. And it's a thing you guys have been planning. And so you're going to wake your little niece or nephew up and say, good morning, how are you? Right? Exciting day, fun stuff happening. Next scene, you're going into the dentist to have a root canal, and you're afraid of the dentist under any circumstance, but you especially don't look forward to a root canal. So and your tooth hurts also, right? So you're going to go in and say to the dentist, well, good morning, how are you, or something, right? Third scene, you're waking up in the morning next to your significant other after the most incredible night of lovemaking you have ever enjoyed. And in that scene, you're going to look at this significant other and say, hey, good morning. How are you? Right? Well, so your delivery in every case will be very, very different. But as far as your mind is concerned, all that's changed is who you believe you are talking to, what relationship you are in with them. And so an important first question as far as getting your mind right for delivery is, what kind of, who can you talk to? How do you imagine your audience in a way that brings out the best in you? I think to help with that, we've actually done exercises with people where we said, okay, I want you to, and I'd recommend this to you, play with this. It'd be a good thing to play with. Get a piece of paper out, and on one side, write down everything you want your audience to believe about you. Well, he's trustworthy. He's smart. Neil, he's likable. The qualities that you want your audience to assign to you, if we were to ask them why they liked watching you. And then on the other side of the page, write down the people in your life who already believe those things are true about you, and see what happens if you play around with the idea of imagining you're talking to one of those people when you're delivering something. Number one, it will help you write in ways that are more meaningful. But number two, it will put you in a relationship that you will tend to live into. And so it's a good way to start to think and to play with this. You want to talk to people who like you. You also want to talk to people who you like and you care about. We had a really interesting call a few years back from Microsoft when they were developing the Surface. You now know it as the Surface tablet. In the early stages, it was a table that had all sorts of interactive qualities. But they called us because the marketing guy called. He said, "We've got a problem. We wonder if you can help us with this. We're designing a product for an audience that none of our designers like, and it's creating a real problem." And what he meant was that their target audience was a particular group that the people designing the thing had a negative opinion about, and they needed help shaping that. So we literally put together a team that went up and role played with those people as examples of the target audience, and worked with them to make a difference in that. It was hurting the development of the product, and it will hurt your delivery if in your own mind you are not talking to people that you truly care about.
The question related to this.
I've got a question coming that's related to this, so I'm stopping and waiting for it.
Al Tompkins asks, how can journalists be believable to people who are watching expressly because the anchor says what the person already believes, even if what they believe is factually wrong? Don't I naturally trust a source who is saying what I believe, and naturally distrust you if you are challenging my belief? And yet journalism at its best is about dispelling myths. So basically, how do I be believable to somebody who who my views are not necessarily in line with, if the idea is that they're watching because,
So the question is from Al Tompkins, who a lot of you know, and who a lot of us, myself included, kind of aspire to be in some ways. The question is, how do I be trustworthy? Al, y'all know you'll message me back if I repeat this in an inaccurate way, but how do I be trustworthy to someone who is kind of fundamentally predisposed to distrust me because I do not represent their point of view about something? I think the answer to, I don't think there is an answer to this that would cover everyone. I think if there is any hope for this, especially if you think about the polarized nature of the media now, and the polarized perception of the media in our world, if there's any hope at all, it's going to be achieved by journalists who somehow have the ability to communicate the idea that I may not agree with you, but I am able to hear you. I am able to authentically hear you and listen to you. And I know that that's a tall order. I know that that's a difficult order, but I don't see how anything is possible without people with the ability, and I actually also with the courage to do that. I mean, there's a reason, with a nod to Al Tompkins' wife, who is a Methodist minister, I think. I know she is. I mean, with a nod to her. The reason the reason Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," I think, is because he understood how hard peacemaking was and how much courage it took to be that thing in the world. So, without waxing too poetic about it, I think the question really goes to the heart of who we need to be at our best and what we ought to represent at our best, which is a place where everyone can be heard and everything. I want to say, I realize there are exceptions when you make a statement like everything, but where everyone can be heard and everything can feel considered. Now, how do we do that? Well, I guess it does mean, it goes back to my point earlier about objectivity. It does mean when we have the opportunity that we ought to ask, are we showcasing opposing views of something with equal energy? And I think it starts. I think it starts there. And obviously, that's a good question, not just for talent once they're on the air, but also for the people who are planning newscasts, who are planning the way that we cover stories. I had a conversation with a reporter this morning who was saying, I feel like there's some things we're undercovering. And I said, well, can you give me an example? He said, yeah, I feel like we're not covering the people who are recovering from COVID-19 enough. Everything is about those we're losing. And he said, I'm not diminishing that at all. He said, but it just feels like there's something that's getting ignored. Anyway, the question at the heart of it always is, are we responsibly representing everybody as fairly as we possibly can? And Al, I hope that at least is a noble attempt to answer that question. Sort of to finish that, so I talked about giving you takeaways. So takeaway one, as far as managing your thinking for a newscast, is put yourself in the position of talking to people who will bring out the best in you. And I guess kind of go back to Al's thing for me. I guess the distinction I do want to make is that I'm not saying of talking to people who politically agree with you. When I say bring out the best in you, I mean people who believe things like people who believe in your goodwill, people who believe in your intelligence, people who believe you can be trusted to be fair. That's more what I mean when I make that recommendation. I thank you, Al. I think that's a really important distinction. So that's takeaway number one. Imagine an audience that will bring out the best in you. Takeaway number two, drop the fantasy that you can pretend to know and that you can pretend to care. We have actually, there's a way in which, it's not the way that the president means it, but there is a way in which we absolutely deserve the label fake news. Or maybe to be more accurate, fake news involvement, especially as far as anchors and anchor delivery is concerned. We've literally evolved systems. We have systems that have evolved, that have fundamentally evolved to make it possible for anchors to do their jobs without thinking. Right? We say, look, as long as you just read this cleanly and read this at the pace that I need, and be happy when it's funny and be sad when it's not. That's all I need you to do. Don't ask any questions unless I have pre-approved them ahead of time. Don't change a word of what I've written. In other words, I don't need you to think. I just need you to read. And look, it's just fundamentally true. If caring is at the heart of developing authentic trust, you cannot care if you do not know. And another way to say that would be, or let me put it this way. Think of it, preparation is the mother of authenticity. Preparation is the mother of authenticity. We work, and for many years, we've worked with anchors at all levels. And, you can spend a lot of time. It's important to spend time to get good at the skills. And it's important to spend time at mastering reading well and eliminating mistakes and knowing how you look your best on camera. All of those things are tremendously important, but invariably, anchors hit a wall that they cannot get past and cannot transcend unless they can literally own what they are saying. Up until that point, it's all just sort of spit and polish. But the very, very best and most important work is done by people who know and own what they are saying, and you cannot know and own it unless you have done the work to understand it and to make choices about it. One of the biggest problems with a lot of anchor work we observe is that, you might hear it and you might say, well, that was read beautifully. Everything was kind of where it expected to be, but it still did not quite do anything for me. Well, often that's because the anchor has read it, but the anchor has not made any decisions about it. The anchor doesn't know it well enough to have made any choices about it, about what matters most, about what they're intending to express with that. So there is simply a level of delivery and performance you cannot achieve. And authenticity, you cannot achieve without having done the work of preparing and the work of knowing. And if we're all really honest with ourselves, there are some ways in which we have actually, and some ways in which we continue to be, in the business of faking. And I think we've got to come to terms with that. I meant to say earlier, just to backtrack for a second, that another reason I think this conversation about authenticity is tremendously important is because the generation that we're interested in talking to, the demo at this point, which is made up of Gen Xers and millennials, is a group. When I was a kid, being on TV was still kind of a miracle. I mean, people dressed up to go to TV stations. Now, I've got kids who grew up. Well, actually, mine are just a little older than this, but I know a number of you have kids, and kids who are growing up in a world where everybody's growing up with FaceTime. They've been talking to people on camera, as far as they know, their whole lives. And so their radar is for a kind of conversation that feels very informal, and to them authentic, and to them real. And there are a lot of ways, and I know we could have long conversations about it, that we may have to come to terms with the ways in which newscasts and newscasting has evolved to basically signal to people, I'm not being real. I'm not really talking to you. And those devices, which served a purpose at one time, may actually be a problem for us now. Preparation is the mother of authenticity. I think that in all these conversations, that's probably one of the most important and inescapable truths we can talk about. Third thought, as far as the mentality about all this, is just this, and it may be that in the current circumstance, and by that I mean people being isolated and afraid and alone and at home, it may be especially valuable to, not just say what you're going to say, but to showcase how you're learning it. This is really the, I don't know who would claim the coining of the idea of process reporting. Maybe someone at Frank Maggot, I just don't know. But this idea of literally saying, I've been talking to so-and-so, we've been learning from so-and-so. I want to get that on your radar because I do think there is something with the move home that you want to be especially careful about. This has implications also for the way that you set up your home spaces. And that is, I'm not sure it serves us to give people the impression that we are just as isolated and disconnected as they are. Your job as journalists, your job as communicators is essentially be the people who can go where I can't, who are connected in ways that I cannot be. And so it may be that the process reporting that literally expressing these things is important in the world right now, because it reminds me she's connected, he's connected. As far as home spaces go, it's one of the concerns I have about home spaces that have nothing emblematic of connection at all. One of the things we've been telling clients has been, look, the best home space may be some combination of things that are personal, things that tell us a little bit about who you are and the fact that you are at home, and also things that are emblematic of your connection to a larger world. That could be as simple maybe as a computer screen that's on, or a monitor that's on. But it's like the stuff we were talking about with delivery. We know human beings are subconsciously seeing a whole lot more than they are seeing consciously. And there's no reason that wouldn't apply to a picture of you sitting at home. And so important to ask the question, what is this communicating about me and about my work, both consciously and both subliminally? Also, I had another interesting question today I just want to share. I'd love to hear other comments about this, but an anchor asked me, what did I think about anchors doing TikTok? That they had been seeing a lot of people doing TikTok. And my first honest answer was, I haven't really thought about it. But I did have one thought as we talked about it. And that was that it does feel to me like I would want to be careful about doing that, at least to the extent that it started to feel like I was at home like everybody else with nothing else to do. That puts me in the same boat as my viewers. And our whole stock in trade is showing viewers a larger world. And so I think that is an important, really important and special concern here, and something that's got to be in the conversation. Really kind of leads me to my next guideline, which I'd articulate this way. We said this in the guide as well, which is really important. I think that you think like a pilot and not like a passenger. And what I mean by that, actually, that came from an interview I was reading with Sullenberger, the pilot who landed the plane on the Hudson, who made the point that no matter how desperate or dire things get, a pilot's mentality is to always be looking for a solution, always be looking for a way out. Inherent in that is the faith and is the belief that he or she may be able to find a way out. That's a pilot's mentality. A passenger's mentality is, because they have lost all control, is just to sit in their seat, follow instructions, and hope for the best. It's very much a victim. You're at the mercy of everything and everyone else. And I don't think that's what we want our organizations to be. And I certainly think as anchors and reporters, it is not who you want to be. One reason the world needs you right now, one reason we all need you right now, is we need to believe and know and see that someone is working to work this out. Someone is working to understand and find the way out of this and believes it can be found. And so I think it's a tremendously important mindset, and really useful to start to ask yourself, not only, let's say I'm an anchor, not only what does it cause me to want to cover, what questions does it cause me to want to ask, but what energy do I want to have when I ask them? Do people not only hear and appreciate the question, but can they feel my curiosity? Can they feel my need for an answer? And so it goes not just to what you say again, but it also goes to how you say it. This also includes considering the emotional impact of what you're sharing for viewers. One thing that Sullenberger says about that day in the plane, he said he only said one thing himself to the cabin. And his words were brace for impact. But he in the interview, he said he thought before he said it about how important the way he said it would be. And I think that goes to the heart, or goes to at least a part of the heart of what you do as well. It is understanding and caring about the impact the things you're sharing is having on people. That doesn't mean if it's going to make them cry that you should cry. I think a better analogy is the analogy of being a doctor with great bedside manner. You know, the kind of person who can communicate, I know I'm not going through what you're going through. I personally am not feeling what you're feeling, but I empathize with it and I understand it. And I know what I'm sharing with you is doing to you. And care deeply about that. I think that's a better analogy for that. Last but not least, last but most, and I alluded to this a minute ago in something else I was talking about. I don't know that there's anything from a delivery standpoint and from a mental standpoint that you can do that is more powerful than asking yourself the question, okay, I'm going to be talking about this. What do I need people to know? Need is the fuel that drives the best delivery. I don't care where it's an anchor lead or a reporter in the field or it doesn't matter. Human beings are fundamentally different when we need to be understood. We show up in an entirely different, palpable, powerful way. So if I only got to say one thing to you ever, then the one thing I think I would probably say to you would be, make a choice. What do you need people to know? And then decide how hard you're going to work at communicating that with them. They're kind of back to it really works back to my point a few minutes ago about making choices and about how the point of all this is not polish. The point of all this is not perfection. The point of this is helping our world navigate. And if you want my trust, I need to know you care about me. I need to know you understand me. I need to know you care enough that you need me to understand. That's why we say that connecting with your need is the fuel of the really best and the really most profound delivery. So those things, from the standpoint of getting your mind right for delivering news, particularly when you are, I think at any time, but especially when you're talking to communities that are in a time of real anxiety and fear and need you. That's all a really, really good start. Do we have any more questions? Do you have anything? All right. Well, look, if anybody has any more questions in hindsight on any of this, please send them, and we'll get back to you with an answer. Again, if you want a copy of our guide for all this, a lot of stuff I've talked about today, it's available on our website. There is also opportunity there, really legitimate opportunity for complimentary coaching. One of the ways we are working to support people like you who are covering the pandemic is there's a group of coaches there who are all volunteering time every week to offer feedback to anyone who needs it. That's available on a first come, first served basis, but no strings attached, nothing expected. As people who have spent our careers in newsrooms and believe deeply in what you represent and who you are, and who understand that lives depend on people believing you and trusting you, we feel like the way we do our part is being helpful to you and supporting you in whatever we can. And so that's a part of how we're doing it. Also, please, we've started a Facebook group to discuss performance. I know there are amazing, good groups that are discussing storytelling and other things. We felt like it might be useful to have a place for us to all think together about delivery specifically. Look, research is really, really clear that more minds are always better than one mind. And so this is not a place for me or anyone on this side to preach about anything. It's really a place we would love to have some really robust conversation about this part of what you do, your performance and your delivery. The group is called Delivering News When the News Hurts, News Anchors in Times of Crisis. It's not a name that the algorithms have loved. And so if you have problems finding it, then email Barrett at barrynashandcompany.com, and I know she can easily get a link to you. Email me, Barry at barrynashandcompany.com, and email me, and I'll get a link to you. We'll plan to convene this again same time next week. If that changes, we'll make sure that it gets out loud and as loudly as we can to talk about the second piece of this, which is managing your speaking. I think it's a really important conversation, especially in this conversation we're having about how do we talk to people in a way that feels real? How do we talk to people in a way that feels accessible? So thank you all again for the time. It's our privilege to be on your team in a way, and please if and when you think there's any way we can be helpful. All of us on this side want to know. Have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation with you soon.